Okay, so Nancy, why don't you talk about what Granddad was up to during World
I
War
sure
II?
will, because I just went home eventually from Pearl Harbor, so I'll tell you, I'm going to talk about Granddad, because I realized he just wasn't coming back, and the Navy offered to send me home at their expense, so I took it. I'm glad I did. I missed Pearl Harbor. All right, in the Philippines, Joe was with nothing but men around because uh, there was one or two Navy wives that were out there because Manila was their home, and they were allowed to go home, you see, and because their husbands, that they had met their husbands and married, and there you were. But that was it for practically the whole fleet that was out there, and none of them had their wives. The admiral wouldn't allow it, and I disliked it at the time, but he was smarter than the rest of us. He didn't want any of us to get trapped if we didn't, you see. The army wives could go, and many of them did get trapped into a prison, and it was very bad. In fact, one of the ladies that Joe knew out there, unmarried, and she died in the camp because her appendix burst on her. So you can see what it was like. Well, that's neither here nor there. I want to talk about Joe. He was awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning by somebody on the ship that informed him he was the only officer aboard. Everybody else had gone to Manila, but he had the duty. And they were to go into dry dock the next day. So they had packed their suitcases and taken them up and left them at the clubhouse where they were all going to be staying. But Joe was the only one that didn't because he had the duty and he was going to do it the next day. Because going in dry dock meant that you just stayed ashore while the ship was being attended to as quickly as possible. But it could be several weeks, or it could be, a month, or even 2 or 3 days maybe. It was to be roughly a month for him, they thought. He was awakened at 3 in the morning and told about Pearl Harbor. So he immediately got up and started getting the ship ready to go out. And fortunately for him, the captain of the submarine next to him, who was a friend of his, and a West Virginian, I mind, and he helped him, and he would ask him, what do I do next, and that helped him to really get the ship in shape. So when the officers heard about this, and they would, of course, immediately head for getting back to the ship, and when they would arrive, they would be able to get out because they knew that they would be bombing the ships after Pearl Harbor, that they were going to tear into Manila, which is exactly what they did, and go for the ships that were out there too. And the ones that could get away, the best and the easiest were the submarines, because they couldn't be seen very well. We did lose one submarine when they left. Unfortunately, it had one of our best friends among them, and it was very sad, but they did. They lost one of the ships, one of the submarines. That was the only one, but they lost a couple of destroyers, and 2 destroyers, as a matter of fact. And then one that crippled so badly that made it to New York City, going all the way around, not even through the Panama Canal, and into the other ocean where they had to worry about the Germans there.
They went under South Africa?
Now don't ask me why. All I know is that it happened. And he got to New York City. It was a destroyer. And so they didn't know where to go, actually, to start with, because they would just find some place in Hawaii among the islands to try and slip up a little stream and hide themselves at night when they had to take on ammunition and get the engines going and stuff like that, you see. So they got, and then finally they were told where to go and to go to, I can't think of it.
Was it Australia?
Australia, Perth, Australia.
They didn't. So Granddad didn't get to Hawaii, right? Didn't he go through Indonesia? You were showing me on a map.
I'm sorry.
So he went from Manila.
Oh, they went from Manila straight south. Well, not straight south.
Mm-hmm.
They were hiding all the way down the South Pacific Ocean, and then. But there's so many islands and places you could hide, really. And they made it all, but one of them, I don't know where it was lost. But I think it was lost by a destroyer bombing it, if I recall.
And so what you're trying to say is that all of the submarines were called to rendezvous in Australia?
Yes, at Perth, Australia. And so I made it one, which was pretty good considering. And from there on, let me see, December the 6th was Pearl Harbor. I didn't know if Joe was dead or alive or where he was or anything until Good Friday in the spring. Long time.
So as Nancy continues to talk, I'm going to Google what day Good Friday was in 1942. So we'll find out the exact date. But keep talking about where Granddad was.
All right. Well, they that was where they home ported, but they were at sea all the time, and his submarine got in trouble one time with something wrong in the engine room, and they had to be towed in the last few miles or so, and that was kind of bad, Joe said, because they were so exposed. But anyhow, they got in. They got in. And
as a point of clarification, Good Friday in 1942 was on April 3rd. So from December 7th to April 3rd, Nancy didn't know where Joe Dodson was, whether he was alive or dead. It's a long time, Nancy.
Yes, it was, because it was, kind of awful. Because I would hear who had been lost on such and such a ship at Pearl Harbor. It was just awful. But anyhow, we survived it. I had no idea that he'd be gone for 3 years. But the world broke out, you see. And then he couldn't get out of the South Pacific. And when they finally, after he'd been at sea for 3 years, said that he could go home, they put him on a ship at Perth, and he was so happy about it, and cabled me and everything. Then, when he got up to the last port they were going out of from Australia, they took him off the ship and put him on of all things, put the submarine on a destroyer, and he just hated it because he got the engine room, and of course he didn't know that much about the engines in a destroyer because they're quite different from what the submarine was, and he had never had an engineer duty, so he was very unhappy. But and that I can't remember the name of the ship right now. I should. I've been to their reunions, but I can't recall it right now.
So during those 2 years when Granddad was stationed sort of out of Perth, right?
Right.
They did a lot of fighting in the South Pacific Islands.
Well, they were submarines were after Japanese ships, you see, and they were in the South Pacific, and they didn't necessarily come in every Friday. They may be gone for 2, 3, 4 weeks, a month, or something.
Right. But Granddad was fighting in the South Pacific. His submarine was.
Oh, they were fighting. He was in some of the. They had some big things in there. Where fortunately were mainly the big ships, the battleships, and I can't even recall the names of them now. But
there was a battle at Iwo Jima, right?
Well, Iwo Jima. Well, the first place they went in was Guadalcanal, but Joe had written me and asked me to send him some underwear which I did. So I figured I didn't have to worry about Guadalcanal because he was somewhere where it was cold. What I didn't know was that his destroyer was the first destroyer in Guadalcanal.
Oh my
and they took quite a beating. But
was it a destroyer or his submarine?
Yes, he was in a destroyer there. And he was his destroyer was the first one that was in the first destroyer, not battleships and aircraft carriers and things, in Guadalcanal. So he was through that mess too, but came out alive, and the ship did too. It was, So I never really quite knew where he was, just being stationed at Perth with submarines, you see, but it was different with destroyers and fleets. And we lost, there was a terrible storm. The worst tornado, not tornado.
Hurricane?
Well, they don't call them hurricanes.
Typhoons.
Typhoons. The worst typhoon in history, even to this day, I have a book about it, took place. Now, he was not in a very bad spot for it, but another one of our friends was the destroyer, and he was the skipper. And he finally realized, no matter what he did, he had put all the men were ordered to put their life-saving jackets on to start with, and but he finally realized the beating he was taking and the damage it was doing to his ship, that he was probably going to sink, and he did. And he was in the water for a long time, but he was rescued. Now, the main fleet didn't really know that these ships were having this terrible storm. In those days, you didn't have the messages, you didn't have the things they have today, you see. And they lost several ships. And one of them was one of our favorite persons, that the skipper of the ship. He survived it, and but he always regretted, losing it, and lost a lot of his men. Even though they were in life jackets, there was nobody there to rescue him. He was one of the few that got rescued. And finally, he committed suicide after he'd been ashore about 3 years. He just couldn't get over it. He was still, affected by it. And he didn't even leave a note. It was quite a shock to he and his wife, too, as it was. Well, that's neither here nor there, but these are some of the things that happened during the war. And, of course, we had to worry about Martha's husband, who was an aviator, and he was in the war, and Jane's husband was also on a ship aboard but they were in the area closer to Pearl Harbor, both of them. No, Jim wasn't, because he flew in and out of various places, but he was more in the western Asian part of the thing, but Noyes was the one that was around Pearl Harbor.
Well, when we come back for our next episode, why don't we talk a little bit more about what was going on? Well, Granddad, but also when did Martha get married? So we'll come back in just a minute.
All right.